Interest in socialism has grown in the United States ever since the economic crisis of 2008, when people began to see clearly that the current system was flawed and failing. Various movements emerged. Well, I'm Dee Knight. I live in New York City. I've lived here for about a little over 5 decades, and I've been involved in anti-imperialist movements here now for many years. It was the US war against Vietnam, that was the starting point for me. I was in university at the time, back in the 1960s, and was facing military conscription while also noticing a very large-scale movement for civil rights and Black liberation developing in the United States. I made a decision to refuse to be drafted to fight on the US side against Vietnam. Instead, I moved to Canada, where I became a leader among anti-war exiles. The result for me was to see the government of my own country as the enemy to resist and fight against. I realized this would be a long struggle and decided to dedicate my life to opposing the US war machine. I have witnessed the US war machine wage endless wars, all of which it has either lost decisively or failed to win. In the process, take, for example, in its war against Vietnam, they basically said they wanted to bomb Vietnam back to the Stone Age. And they used defoliant bombs like napalm, as well as what they called carpet bombing. And we also saw that our own soldiers, when they went there, they actually found that the Vietnamese Liberation Forces reached out to them as friends and said, look, if you don't fight us, we won't fight you. And that really happened. And it was the beginning of something that led to the end of the war. First of all, the American soldiers realized they could not beat the Vietnamese Liberation Forces. And they saw that they were being treated really horribly. And so they started to refuse to fight. And the combination of those two things led to a US defeat in Vietnam. Now, in each case, all of these wars, the public official reasons offered by US government leaders were lies. That the US was fighting for democracy or against terrorism or for human rights. In all these cases, the real reason was simply domination, a crazy mania to rule the world and control its wealth and resources. And in addition to the official lies about the purpose of its wars, the politicians and military leaders expressed racism and xenophobia against its chosen enemies, dehumanizing them and encouraging hatred of them. That was true in the US wars against Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, the former Yugoslavia, Libya, Syria, Somalia, Ukraine, and now in West Asia. Something that has stood out now, focusing on the US invasion of Iraq, is the story of Julian Assange, who is now facing extradition from England to the United States, where he is facing 175 years in prison, which is a death penalty, for exposing the crimes of the US in Vietnam. The crimes that he opposed, he captured on film that was given to him by a US Army intelligence soldier, Chelsea Manning. And it showed military people in helicopters making jokes as they identified so-called enemies on the ground, which included ordinary Iraqi people, as well as 3 reporters from Reuters. They shot them in cold blood, and that exposure led to a widespread scandal. And for that reason, Julian Assange is being prosecuted as a spy. So that's the kind of thing we saw there. Alongside the big lies about the purpose of the war machine's political and military leaders expressed false and arrogant superiority over its enemies, and often came to believe its own fantasies that it was sure to win. But in fact, it has failed to win. and has gradually isolated itself more and more. There have been leftist and progressive movements in the United States for a very long time. Most significant was the movement to abolish slavery, which emerged in the mid 19th century and has continued to the present day in many forms, most notably the Black liberation and the Black Lives Matter movement. And I was very strongly affected by that when I was going to school at the San Francisco State University campus back in the mid 60s, when the Black Students Union was the most vocal student group on campus, and they educated me in many, many ways. And one of the real benefits to me was that I was able to see clearly the fact that the movement against racism and the movement against the war really should be seen as one thing. Now, also back in the late 19th century, the movement against US imperialism arose very strongly during the so-called Spanish-American War, when the US moved militarily to take over the fading control by Spain of its colonies in the Caribbean and East Asia, specifically Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Now, these two movements, the anti-racist movement and the anti-imperialist movement, grew as a new North American working class movement emerged, again in the later part of the 19th century. At first, racism and anti-immigrant attitudes, especially anti-Chinese attitudes, crippled the working class movement here. But the formation of a communist movement at the end of World War I, which was a genuinely progressive and anti-racist working class movement, as it grew, especially during the 1930s, when US capitalism had failed and large numbers of workers and progressive people responded to the possibility of socialism, that was the real launch of a major progressive left movement in our country. But following the end of World War II, as the United States emerged as the global winner of that war and launched a war against communist forces in both Europe and Asia, the US government also launched an anti-communist crusade at home, determined to wipe out the progressive and socialist forces that had become strong during the war, and really before the war. The result of this anti-communist crusade was that the left was largely crushed, at least temporarily. But the movement for civil rights of Black people surged forward during the 1950s and became the basis for a resurgence of progressive and leftist social movements, which grew stronger during the 1960s in fights for justice at home and against the US war in Vietnam. These movements also responded to the surge of anti-colonial struggle across the global South at that time, taking inspiration from both the Vietnamese liberation struggle and the Chinese Revolution. But in the wake of the US defeat in Vietnam, in the 1970s, the government launched another wave of repression, especially aimed at the Black liberation movement, in which many leaders of the Black Panther Party, among others, were either killed or incarcerated. I remember visiting the Black Panther Party headquarters in Oakland, California, just shortly after I returned to the United States from exile. And one of the most prominent things was the line of photos of many young leaders of the Black Panthers who had been killed by the police. The government also used mass incarceration through its so-called war on drugs to terrorize and immobilize the Black liberation and progressive movements. I became personally involved in efforts to revive the anti-war movement and the left following my return from exile in the mid-1970s. We built large-scale opposition and resistance to US regime change wars in Central America. I actually went to Nicaragua for 3 years, really to help the Sandinistas there. We also built a strong movement against the US government's support for apartheid in South Africa. Nelson Mandela was called a terrorist by Ronald Reagan back then. And of course, he emerged as a great hero of the African people. Then, as the US mounted its endless war campaign against the peoples of West Asia, we developed massive opposition to US invasions in Iraq and Afghanistan. But it wasn't enough, and the war machine seemed almost unstoppable during that period, really for the past several decades. But with the US proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, and now in response to its manic support of Israeli genocide against the Palestinian people, the progressive anti-imperialist and anti-racist movement in the US and elsewhere is being transformed massively. Interest in socialism has grown in the United States ever since the economic crisis of 2008, when people began to see clearly that the current system was flawed and failing. Various movements emerged. The Occupy Wall Street movement, in which people, especially young people, staged a sustained occupation not only of Wall Street, but of official power centers in various parts of the country. In some cases, notably in California and the Pacific Northwest, where I came from originally, this movement allied with labor union organizers and actually succeeded in shutting down ports in several locations temporarily. The new consciousness of this movement was reflected in the moderate socialist campaign for president of Bernie Sanders in the middle of the decade. That campaign led to mushrooming growth of the moderate Democratic Socialists of America, which grew to a membership of nearly 100,000. That's large by American standards. Then, in response to police murders of Black people in various places in the country, the Black Lives Matter movement emerged, with large multiracial protest actions happening continually in 2020. All of these factors combined with a growing sense of economic pessimism in the country, especially among the youth. There is widespread unemployment among young people and also middle-aged people, alongside deepening indebtedness because of oppressive and really unpayable loans for school, housing, and all the necessities of life. So far, in reality, these concerns have not crystallized in a coherent or unified left or socialist movement. The new level of intensity and massive size and level of unity of the anti-imperialist movement has to do both with the absolute crazy nature of the US government for domination everywhere in Ukraine against Russia, in the Far East against China, making suddenly making NATO a global phenomenon with incorporating the members. But most of all has been the inspiration caused by the Palestinian liberation movement and the outrage at the genocidal slaughter of the Palestinians. What it has been to expose the total hypocrisy of the US government leadership and the fact that it lies continuously, but that it does it while literally bombing the people of Gaza, a tiny strip of land in the eastern Mediterranean, to help Israel wipe them out. The only problem is that the Palestinians refuse to give up. And they have really inspired millions of people, especially young people here, so that the chants you hear on the streets are free, free Palestine, from the river to the sea. Palestine must be free. And it's very interesting, it really harkens back to the era of the US war against Vietnam, when a whole generation rebelled against the government's effort to force us to go and fight against the Vietnamese who were fighting really for independence and freedom. It's very interesting. In many ways, it's the same, but different because it's even bigger, which is really quite remarkable. And it's coming at a different time in the history of the United States. Then the United States was still the undisputed, most powerful country in the world. Now that's no longer true. And people can feel that. And they also can look to China and see that China has been able to win over a majority of countries in the world with no military action whatsoever. only with mutual cooperation for common prosperity and a shared future. This is a much better idea than what the US government is going for. And so, very, very large numbers of people here in this country and also in other countries are rising up to stop the United States and its fascist partner, uh, both in Israel and the Ukraine. It's something very new and very exciting and very hopeful. Well, there is certainly upsurge of interest in socialism in the United States. It has not come together as a coherent single force. It's the kind of thing that will happen first as unity in action, as the various forces find themselves together fighting for the same thing, organizing the same sectors of the population, going to the same actions.